I used to believe grief arrived loudly. I thought it would knock the air from my chest, bring tears that wouldn't stop, leave me shaking in public places. But the truth is, grief often comes quietly. It sits beside you. It waits. And sometimes, it watches while someone rewrites your life as if you were never there. The day my husband's will was read, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't love him. Not because I wasn't broken. But because something inside me had already gone numb. The lawyer's office was filled with the soft hum of an air conditioner and the rustle of paper, small, ordinary sounds that felt wrong for a moment that was supposed to carry weight. There were chairs arranged neatly in a half-circle. Bottled water on a polished side table. Framed certificates on the wall, reminders of authority and finality. I sat near the window, hands folded in my lap, staring at a faint crack in the glass that caught the sunlight just right. I had noticed that crack the moment I walked in. I kept my eyes there, because looking anywhere else meant acknowledging the people in the room. Most of them were strangers. A few acquaintances. And one person who didn't look at me at all. Rebecca. My daughter-in-law sat across from me, spine straight, expression calm, fingers resting lightly on a leather folder she had brought herself. She looked prepared. Not grieving, prepared. I told myself not to read into it. Everyone processes loss differently. That's what people say when they don't want to confront discomfort. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice professional, detached. "We're here to review the final will and estate arrangements of Patrick Sloan." Hearing Patrick's name out loud felt like someone pressing on a bruise I hadn't realized was there yet. Patrick. My husband of 43 years. The man I fed soup to when his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. The man I slept beside in a hospital chair because I refused to leave him alone overnight. I didn't look at Rebecca. I didn't need to. I could feel her stillness from across the room, like she had already decided how this story would end. The lawyer began reading. At first, everything sounded familiar. Investments. Properties. Accounts I recognized, numbers I had discussed with Patrick years ago at our kitchen table while drinking tea that always went cold before we finished talking. Then the language shifted. Control of the primary family trust has been transferred. I lifted my eyes from the window. Transferred? The lawyer continued, tone unchanged. To Rebecca Sloan, effective 6 months prior. 6 months. My heart gave a small, confused thud. 6 months ago, Patrick couldn't walk without help. 6 months ago, I was managing medication schedules and doctor visits and late-night panic attacks when he woke up disoriented and afraid. 6 months ago, he had squeezed my hand and said, "You don't need to worry. I've taken care of everything." The lawyer kept reading. Names were mentioned. Assets assigned. Responsibilities outlined. My name did not appear. At first, I assumed I had missed it. My hearing wasn't what it used to be. Maybe he had already read my portion and I hadn't registered it. But then the lawyer reached the end. There was a pause. The kind that invites questions. One of the men at the table, an associate, I think, cleared his throat. "And Mrs. Sloan?" he asked, glancing between his notes and the lawyer. "What provisions are outlined for her?" The lawyer hesitated for just a second. Rebecca didn't. "There are none," she said calmly. I turned to look at her then. She finally met my eyes. Her expression was neutral, almost sympathetic, like someone delivering unfortunate news they had rehearsed many times. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look unsure. She looked finished. The lawyer nodded, as if confirming a technical detail. Correct. Under the finalized filing, there are no remaining distributions assigned. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement of the decades I had spent beside the man whose life was now being itemized. I didn't speak. I felt heat crawl at my spine, but my hands remained folded, my posture unchanged. Something inside me understood instinctively that reacting would only give the moment power it didn't deserve. The meeting continued. They discussed timelines, legal processing, next steps. I sat there, invisible. When it was finally over, chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood. Conversations resumed in low, professional tones, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Rebecca gathered her things with precise movements. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. As she passed me, she placed a small box on the table. "He wanted you to have this," she said. I looked down. Inside was a silver tie clip. That was all. No note. No letter. No explanation. Patrick had been a man of words. He wrote notes on napkins. He left messages in books. He scribbled thoughts on scrap paper and tucked them into drawers like secrets meant to be found later. And yet, according to Rebecca, this was all he had left me. A tie clip he barely wore. I waited for something else. For her to say more. For her to hesitate. For her voice to crack. She didn't. She walked away like she had just completed a task on a checklist. That night, the house felt different. Not empty, wrong. Patrick's shoes were still by the door. His jacket still hung on the back of the chair. The faint scent of his aftershave lingered in the hallway. But the air felt colder, sharper, like something had shifted while I wasn't looking. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second stretching too long. For the first time since Patrick died, I felt something worse than grief. I felt erased. The next message didn't come from Rebecca. It came from her assistant. Subject line: Estate Administration Meeting. No greeting. No condolences. Just a time, a date, and an address. Wednesday. 9 a.m. Like an appointment. Like an obligation. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the building that morning for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, wondering if there was any point. Whatever had been decided had already been finalized. Rebecca had made sure of that. But something inside me, quiet, stubborn, refused to stay home. The office was sleek and modern, all glass and muted colors. The receptionist barely glanced up when I gave my name. I was led into a conference room filled with dark suits and closed folders. Rebecca sat at the head of the table. She didn't stand when I entered. She didn't greet me. She simply nodded toward an empty chair at the far end. As executive of the estate, she began outlining the distribution process. Her voice was smooth, confident, practiced. Stocks. Properties. Trust allocations. She spoke like she was presenting quarterly results, not dismantling a life. I listened. And then she said something that made my stomach tighten. The trust was updated prior to Patrick's passing, she explained. Control was reassigned to ensure continuity. Continuity. A word that sounded so reasonable. So harmless. But I knew something was wrong. Patrick would never have done this without telling me. Never. When the meeting ended, I waited until everyone else had left. I stood slowly, smoothed my coat, and walked out without saying a word. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and grounding. I didn't cry. Not yet. That came later. It came that night, when I opened Patrick's desk drawer. I wasn't looking for anything specific. My hands just moved on their own. Receipts. Old notes. A mechanical pencil he loved. And then, at the back, a thin manila folder. No label. Inside were 3 pages. The first was handwritten. Patrick's handwriting. My breath caught as I read the words. Rebecca wants me to revise the will. Says it's for clarity. I haven't signed anything yet. Something doesn't feel right. I read it again. And again. The second page was a draft of a will I had never seen, my name crossed out in red ink. The third was a list of appointments. Legal consultations. Dates from months ago. Dates when Patrick was sick. Dates when I was with him almost every hour. Except when Rebecca came. I sat back in the chair, the folder heavy in my hands. For the first time, the numbness cracked. Patrick hadn't meant to erase me. Someone else had done it for him. And suddenly, the tie clip made sense. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a mistake. That night, as I hid the folder away and turned off the lights, one thought settled into my chest with terrifying clarity. If Rebecca had changed the will while Patrick was still alive, what else had she changed without anyone noticing? And more importantly, how far was she willing to go to keep it hidden? I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, fear comes later, when you understand the full shape of what you're facing, but because my mind wouldn't stop assembling pieces that had never fit before. The folder stayed hidden beneath a stack of old magazines in the hallway closet. I checked it twice before dawn, as if it might vanish on its own. Each time, it was still there. Solid. Real. Proof. By morning, grief had shifted into something colder and sharper. Clarity. Patrick hadn't intended to leave me with nothing. He had hesitated. He had doubted. And somewhere in those doubts was a truth Rebecca had carefully buried. I needed help. Not sympathy. Not comfort. Help. There was only one person I trusted enough to call. Daniel Cowan. Patrick and Daniel had worked together for decades. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, the kind who noticed details other people dismissed as insignificant. When Patrick retired, Daniel had shaken his hand and said, "If you ever need anything, you call." I hadn't called. Until now. He answered on the second ring. There was a pause when I said my name. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have reached out sooner." "We need to talk," I replied. "In person." Another pause. Longer this time. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Elm Street Cafe. 9. The cafe hadn't changed in years. Same chipped mugs. Same narrow booths. Same soft jazz humming overhead like a memory that refused to fade. Daniel slid into the seat across from me, rain still clinging to his coat. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Neither did I. I placed the folder between us. He opened it slowly. As he read, his expression changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the subtle way that told me he was seeing something he didn't like. When he reached Patrick's handwritten note, his jaw tightened. "This," he said quietly, tapping the page, "is not nothing." He flipped to the draft will. The crossed-out line. My name. The red ink. This wasn't finalized, he said. At least, it shouldn't have been. I watched his hands. Steady. Controlled. But his eyes were sharp now, alert. He asked questions. Precise ones. When did I find this? Had anyone else seen it? Did Rebecca know Patrick kept notes like this? No, I said. She always handled the paperwork. I trusted her. Daniel nodded once. Not judgment. Understanding. People like Rebecca, he said carefully, don't move fast unless they're afraid of something. That was the first time anyone had said it out loud. He pulled out a notepad and began writing dates, names, firms Rebecca had mentioned in passing over the years. Then he stopped. The witnesses, he said. Did you recognize them? I shook my head. Patrick had always insisted on witnesses he knew. Friends. Neighbors. People who would look him in the eye and ask if he was sure. Strangers didn't fit. We don't confront her, Daniel said. Not yet. I exhaled slowly. We dig. The digging began quietly. Daniel requested certified copies of the will filed with the county. He asked for timelines. Metadata. Filing numbers. I went home and opened Patrick's calendar. Rebecca had already removed most of his personal belongings, his books, his clothes, his files. She had done it efficiently, like she was cleaning up loose ends. But she hadn't taken the calendar. It was leather-bound, worn soft at the edges. Patrick wrote in pencil. Light pressure. Erasable. Changeable. I flipped through the weeks leading up to his final hospitalization. That's when I saw the name. Hal Givens. Circled. Twice. A Tuesday morning appointment. Hal was a tax consultant Patrick had worked with years ago through a nonprofit initiative. They weren't close, but Patrick respected him. Trusted him. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't hesitate. I'll reach out, he said. Quietly. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. On the surface, my life looked the same. Grocery store. Book club. Short walks around the neighborhood. Underneath, everything had changed. Every conversation replayed differently now. Every memory rewound with a new lens. Rebecca hovering during phone calls. Rebecca insisting she handle emails. Rebecca stepping in whenever Patrick grew tired. At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now, I wondered how early she had started planning. Daniel called on Friday. I spoke with Hal, he said. I sat down. Patrick came to him looking exhausted. Daniel continued. They talked about trust protections. About ensuring you'd be taken care of. My chest tightened. But, Daniel said, Patrick seemed hesitant. Kept saying Rebecca was handling things. Hal had offered an independent review. A second set of eyes. Patrick never scheduled it. A week later, Daniel added, Rebecca called and canceled on his behalf. Silence filled the line. Hal kept intake notes, Daniel said. They aren't binding. But they show intent. Intent. That word carried weight. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. Not for comfort. For context. In photo after photo, Rebecca appeared in the background. Smiling. Organizing. Holding documents. Standing just slightly closer to Patrick than anyone else. She hadn't appeared suddenly. She had been positioning herself for years. The following Monday, Daniel called again. This time, his voice was urgent. The original will, the one you and Patrick reviewed together last year, it's gone. What do you mean, gone? Marked as superseded, he said. But there's no record of who initiated the change. That shouldn't have been possible. Daniel, I said slowly, what does that mean? It means, he replied, someone had access they shouldn't have. He wanted to bring in another attorney. A specialist. Her name was Lydia Velasquez. Probate litigation. Document fraud. Contested wills. I agreed. We met 2 days later. Lydia was efficient, direct, and observant in a way that made you feel both seen and measured. She didn't waste time softening her words. This looks constructed, she said after reviewing the documents. Not sloppy. Not rushed. Constructed. She pointed out details Daniel and I had missed. Formatting changes. Clause removals. Witness substitutions. Patterns. This wasn't about inheritance alone, Lydia said. This was about control. She recommended filing a quiet inquiry. No accusations. Just a freeze. Protection. I nodded. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I just wanted the truth to stop moving without me. That evening, I went into the garage. Patrick's old filing cabinet sat untouched in the corner, dust collecting on the handles. Inside were tax records, grant documents, old trust drafts. In the folder labeled last year, I found something that made my hands tremble. A draft titled Revocable Living Trust, Addendum. Unsigned. Marked up. My name appeared repeatedly under a section labeled Survivor Protections. Healthcare. Housing. Legal support. Beside it, in Patrick's handwriting. We talked about this. Rebecca said she'd handle it. I sat on the concrete floor for a long time. This wasn't negligence. This was delegation. Patrick hadn't abandoned me. He had trusted the wrong person. Daniel copied the document the next morning. Lydia filed the motion that afternoon. 3 days later, she called. The estate is frozen, she said. Temporarily. Rebecca could no longer move assets. No longer reassign property. For the first time since the will reading, I breathed freely. That same day, an envelope arrived in the mail. Glossy. Heavy paper. An invitation. Rebecca was hosting a private tribute to Patrick at the country club. Cocktails. Charity auction. Donors. My name appeared as a guest. I stared at it. She had erased me legally. Now she wanted me present socially. I didn't throw it away. I smiled. Because if Rebecca believed she could rewrite history without witnesses. She had just invited one into the room. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Daniel. Not Lydia. Not even myself, out loud. But on the night of Rebecca's tribute, I dressed carefully, not for confrontation, not for revenge, but for presence. There is a difference. I chose navy slacks and a silk blouse Patrick had given me years earlier for our anniversary. Simple. Clean. Nothing that demanded attention. Everything that reminded me who I was before someone tried to erase me. The country club parking lot was nearly full when I arrived. Valets moved briskly, greeting guests by name. Inside, the room glowed with warm lighting and polished wood, the kind of place where grief is meant to look elegant and contained. A framed photograph of Patrick stood near the entrance. I hated that picture. Rebecca had chosen it for the obituary, too, the one where Patrick looked thin, his smile faint, his eyes tired. It wasn't the man I knew. It was the version that made people feel sorry instead of curious. She stood near the center of the room, greeting guests with practiced warmth. Her posture was perfect. Her smile calibrated. She looked like someone who had already rehearsed her closing remarks. When she saw me, something flickered. Just for a second. Then it disappeared. "Marietta," she said smoothly, stepping forward. "I'm so glad you could make it." I nodded. "Of course." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "It means a lot." It didn't. But I let the moment pass without correction. I moved toward the quieter side of the room, where auction items were displayed under soft lighting. Patrick's favorite things, the placards read. A signed baseball. A vintage pen. A first edition novel. My stomach tightened when I recognized it. I had given him that book. My name wasn't mentioned. I stepped back. A man approached me, one of Patrick's former business partners. He looked relieved to see me, as if my presence corrected something he hadn't realized was off. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm managing," I said truthfully. He nodded. I wanted to ask, "Are you planning to make changes to the foundation's allocations?" I stared at him. "Changes?" I repeated. "Yes," he said. "Now that you're overseeing things." The realization hit like a quiet explosion. Rebecca hadn't told everyone. She had let them assume. "I'm not overseeing anything," I said gently. That role was reassigned. His expression shifted, confusion, then discomfort. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize." Neither did he. Neither did several others I spoke with that night. Rebecca had been selective with her version of the truth. She had claimed authority without explanation and let silence do the rest. I stayed only long enough to gather impressions, not evidence. But then someone said something that changed everything. One of Patrick's former board colleagues leaned in during a casual conversation near the bar. "Rebecca sent an email weeks before Patrick passed," he said, almost as an aside. "About donation targets. Legal language. Managing partner responsibilities. Weeks before." I thanked him and excused myself. In my car, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, everything crystallized. Rebecca hadn't waited. She had prepared. She had transitioned power while Patrick was still alive. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. The next morning, Daniel and Lydia listened without interruption as I relayed everything. The assumptions. The emails. The omissions. Lydia leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "This crosses into coercion," she said. "Possibly undue influence." They began drafting a motion to formally contest the will, not just for my share, but for the integrity of Patrick's intentions. 2 days later, the court accepted the filing. Discovery was granted. That meant access. Emails. Internal records. Digital timestamps. Doors Rebecca believed were locked were about to open. The first real crack came faster than I expected. Lydia called one afternoon, her tone sharp but controlled. "We found an email," she said. "Sent 6 weeks before Patrick passed." She read the subject line aloud. Revised structure, immediate actions. Rebecca had instructed her team to expedite final trust documents and remove all discretionary clauses. One line stood out. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. That was it. Decades of marriage reduced to a directive. I closed my eyes. There was no rage. Just resolve. 3 days later, Lydia filed subpoenas. One of Rebecca's legal assistants agreed to speak. Her name was Ava Kendall. She arrived at Lydia's office on a Tuesday morning, exactly on time, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't there to accuse. She wasn't there to dramatize. She was there because she had written something down and couldn't forget it. She described staying late one Sunday evening, going back for her jacket, seeing Rebecca in the conference room with unsigned documents. Rebecca had asked her to witness a signature. Patrick was not present. When Ava hesitated, Rebecca brushed it off. "It's urgent," she had said. "Just sign." Ava had written it down. 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witnessed signature. No Patrick present. She still had the note. When she finished, the room was silent. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was testimony. Rebecca's response was swift. Her attorney sent a letter accusing me of interference, grief-driven confusion, and bitterness. They threatened legal action if I didn't withdraw my claim. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my coffee. Then I called Daniel. "I'm not withdrawing," I said. He smiled through the phone. "Good," he replied. "Neither are we." 2 days later, Rebecca's name appeared on another invitation. This time, it wasn't social. It was official. The Foundation's board was meeting to finalize the transfer of executive authority. I was invited. I told Lydia I was going. Daniel hesitated. "I won't make a scene," I assured him. "I just want to be there." The glass-walled boardroom felt colder than the country club. Polished. Detached. Rebecca sat at the head of the table. When she spoke about Patrick's vision, her words were flawless. Then she looked at me. "And with your grace," she said, "we'll carry it forward." Grace. As if I had consented. I reached into my bag and slid a small envelope down the table. It passed from hand to hand. Ava's statement. The altered trust page. Lydia's summary. I stood. "Thank you for the invitation," I said calmly. "My attorney will be in touch." And I walked out. By that evening, the board had postponed their vote. Rebecca's lawyer went silent. And for the first time, I understood something crucial. Rebecca didn't fear losing money. She feared losing the story. The days after the board meeting were unnervingly quiet. No calls. No letters. No carefully worded threats delivered by legal stationery. Lydia warned me this was normal. When control slips, people retreat to reassess. Silence, she said, is rarely peace, it's preparation. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt like something had shifted. I went back to routine, not because everything was resolved, but because I refused to let Rebecca's choices dictate the rhythm of my life any longer. I watered the plants. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings. I cooked meals I barely touched. The house no longer felt hostile. It felt watchful. As if it knew the truth was coming. 3 days later, Lydia called. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled," she said. 2 weeks. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with gravity. This was no longer private. This was no longer speculation exchanged in quiet offices. This was record. The hearing wouldn't decide everything. It would determine whether the court believed there was enough evidence to proceed with a full examination of the will and trust. Enough to pull Rebecca's work into the light. In preparation, Lydia assembled a timeline that made everything unmistakably clear. Patrick's illness. Rebecca's increased involvement. The missing original will. The altered witness signatures. The Sunday evening timestamps. Each item alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, Lydia invited me to her office to review a new batch of documents recovered through discovery. Emails. Internal messages. Scheduling notes. She slid one page across the table. "This one matters," she said. It was an email Rebecca had sent from her firm account to an outside consultant. The subject line was harmless. Transition planning. But the content made my chest tighten. Rebecca outlined anticipated delays due to Patrick's condition. She emphasized the importance of executing revisions before further decline complicates consent. Consent. The word sat there, cold and precise. She hadn't just anticipated his death. She had planned around his weakening voice. Rebecca's attorney responded aggressively once the hearing date was set. They filed motions challenging Ava's credibility. They claimed Patrick was of sound mind. They framed Rebecca as a devoted daughter-in-law unfairly targeted by grief and resentment. It was polished, strategic, and incomplete. Because what they couldn't explain were the timestamps. The security logs. The digital trail that showed documents uploaded on days Patrick never left the house. The hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Wooden benches lined the walls, worn smooth by decades of waiting bodies and unspoken anxieties. Rebecca arrived first. She wore a tailored suit and calm confidence. She nodded politely at people she recognized. She did not look at me. I took my seat behind Lydia, hands folded, breathing steady. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Lydia spoke plainly. No drama. No embellishment. She laid out the facts. She showed Patrick's handwritten notes. She presented Ava's statement. She introduced the discrepancy between witness signatures and office access logs. Rebecca's attorney objected frequently. The judge listened carefully. When Lydia finished, Rebecca's counsel argued that illness does not equate to incapacity. That delegation is not coercion. That grief distorts memory. Then Lydia stood again. "Your Honor," she said, "we are not asking the court to rule on intent today. We are asking the court to allow us to examine whether the documents presented truly reflect the decedent's final wishes." The judge paused. Long enough that I felt every second stretch. Then he nodded. "The motion for full discovery is granted." The room shifted. Rebecca's composure faltered, not dramatically, but noticeably. A tightening around the mouth. A slight rigidity in her shoulders. It was subtle. But it was there. Discovery changed everything. Emails once buried in archived folders were pulled forward. Calendar logs were cross-referenced. One document in particular caught Lydia's attention. An internal memo Rebecca had written to herself. No recipients. No formatting. Just notes. Finalize before he changes his mind. I read that line 3 times. Patrick had been hesitant. He had questioned. He had almost spoken. The following week, Rebecca withdrew from her role as managing executive of the foundation. The announcement was brief, carefully worded. No mention of the legal challenge. She framed it as a decision made in the best interest of preserving the organization's mission. I didn't react. Not outwardly. Because this wasn't about her stepping down. It was about something far quieter. She was retreating. Daniel visited one afternoon with an update. The board is requesting an internal review, he said. Independent oversight. He smiled slightly. They're nervous. Good. Nervous people ask questions. That evening, I found myself in Patrick's study again. I opened drawers I had avoided for months. Not because they hurt, but because I hadn't been ready. In the back of one drawer, behind old ledgers, I found a sealed envelope. No label. Inside was a copy of an earlier will, dated a year before Rebecca's revision. It named me as co-trustee. Included detailed provisions for my care. Included notes in Patrick's handwriting, personal, thoughtful, unmistakably his. At the bottom, he had written, "If anything feels rushed, slow it down." I sat with that page until the light faded. The final blow came quietly. Rebecca's legal team sent an email to Lydia late one Friday afternoon. They would no longer contest the trust inquiry. Rebecca was withdrawing completely. No admission. No apology. Just retreat. I stood in the backyard as the sun dipped below the trees, phone still in my hand. The wind moved through the branches Patrick had planted decades ago. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was chasing the truth. I felt like it had caught up on its own. But as the legal dust settled, one question remained, one I hadn't dared to ask until now. If Patrick had written one will that protected me, why had he hidden it instead of showing me? I didn't open the envelope right away. I placed it on Patrick's desk and sat across from it, as if the paper itself might speak if I gave it time. The study smelled faintly of dust and old books, the same way it always had. Nothing about the room had changed. And yet everything had. For weeks, I had chased facts. Dates. Emails. Signatures. I had learned how easily truth could be bent when someone had access and patience. But this envelope felt different. This wasn't evidence. This was Patrick. I broke the seal carefully. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. Not long. Not dramatic. Just Patrick, speaking the way he always did when he didn't want to make a fuss but still needed to be understood. He didn't start with an apology. He started with honesty. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "it means I didn't get the chance to say everything out loud." My breath caught, but I kept reading. He wrote about being tired. Not just from illness, but from the pressure of decisions he felt ill-equipped to fight anymore. He admitted that he had let Rebecca take over more than he should have, not because he trusted her more than me, but because he didn't want to burden me when I was already carrying so much. That part hurt. But it didn't break me. Because then he wrote this. I was afraid that if I questioned her too loudly, things would escalate while I was weak. I thought silence would buy time. I thought I could fix it later. I closed my eyes. Patrick hadn't been careless. He had been afraid. Not of me. Not of death. But of conflict, of chaos erupting while he was losing control of his body. He had hidden the earlier will not to deceive me, but to protect me from being pulled into something ugly before he understood how deep it went. "If something doesn't feel right," he wrote, "trust yourself. You always see the truth before I do." The letter ended simply. You were never forgotten. You were never replaced. And nothing meaningful I built was ever meant to exist without you. I sat there long after I finished reading, the paper resting loosely in my hands. Rebecca had taken assets. She had taken authority. She had taken credit. But she hadn't taken this. The legal matters concluded quietly. No trial. No spectacle. No dramatic verdict. Rebecca's withdrawal stood as its own confession. The court restored my name to the public record, not as a beneficiary fighting for money, but as a co-trustee whose role had been improperly removed. The foundation acknowledged the correction without fanfare. Daniel asked if I wanted to pursue damages. Lydia asked if I wanted to push further. I said no. Not because I had forgiven Rebecca, but because I had already reclaimed what mattered. My name. My place. My voice. Life didn't suddenly become peaceful. Grief doesn't disappear just because truth surfaces. Some mornings, I still reached for Patrick's side of the bed before remembering he wasn't there. Some evenings, the quiet pressed too close. But the house no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. I began sorting through Patrick's papers, not for evidence this time, but for memory. Notes he'd written. Ideas he never finished. Lists of books he wanted to read and places he wanted to visit. In one notebook, I found a sentence underlined twice. Legacy isn't what survives you. It's what survives because of you. I understood that now. A few weeks later, I attended a small foundation meeting. Not as an executive. Not as a symbol. Just as someone who had been there at the beginning. No one made speeches. No one asked me to say anything. But when I left, one of the younger board members stopped me at the door. I'm glad you're still here, she said. So was I. On the first warm day of spring, I returned to the community garden Patrick and I had helped fund years earlier. New growth was already pushing through the soil, green, stubborn, alive. I knelt to touch the ground and smiled. Rebecca had believed that control was power. But power doesn't come from paperwork. It comes from presence. From knowing who you are when someone tries to write you out. From standing still long enough for the truth to catch up. That night, I placed Patrick's letter back into the envelope and tucked it into the drawer beside my bed. Not hidden. Not locked away. Just there. Because some things aren't meant to be used as proof. They're meant to be remembered. If you've ever felt erased. If someone tried to rewrite your story while you were still standing in the room. If silence was mistaken for weakness. Remember this. You don't have to shout to reclaim your place. You only have to stay present long enough for the truth to surface. And sometimes, the most powerful inheritance isn't money at all. It's knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away.